Chapter 31. Fallen Gods. Sabrina came to, trembling beneath something heavy. She had begun crying even before she had awakened. She now gave herself over to it completely. Only when the weight interfered with the heaving of her sobs did she push the headless feral away to the floor. The sight of what she had done inflamed her emotions further. She crawled on all fours across the floor towards the light of the window with its billowing curtain. In that moment, that curtain seemed to offer a perfect promise of normalcy. The wind gently filling it so it flared like a woman's skirt, an eternal tableau of peace, unaffected by the chaos outside. She had played just beneath such a curtain once, surrounded by the scent of forget-me-nots, coffee, and her mother's baking bread. Now she only yearned to curl up in that fleeting moment, to grab the apron strings of eternity as they passed. She wept. Wept for all the losses she had never let herself feel. Wept for that girl, Annalise, who had lost everything, and then been exiled to suffer in lonely isolation. And she wept with guilt, because she had been the one who did it. The hemorrhaging seemed endless, and yet she did not want it to end. She deserved the pain. It was both the punishment and release she had been waiting for her entire life. Only when those waves began to subside did she become aware of the touch on her shoulder, patting her lightly, as one child might another. "It's all right." Sabrina spun around. The girl she had exiled to the boat, her younger self. Annalise was there beside her. 4 years old with the same black hair, fair skin, kneeling on the checkered floor beside her. Sabrina reached out to touch her. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Annalise." Annalise reached back. "It's all right. You saved us." Sabrina blinked. Annalise's black hair became blonde. She was not 4, but 10. Amat knelt before her. Nani stood behind her in the doorway, her thumb in her mouth, her other hand clasping Drim's. Amat had set Sabrina's blasters down next to her, side by side, one covered in the feral's blood and gray brain matter. The child rubbed her hands on her skirt, trying to remove the gore. "We have to get out of here," Sabrina said, sitting up. The foot of the dead man was visible around the kitchen island. Even though her shot had struck his head, and the smell of burnt hair and flesh filled the room, she could not shake the feeling that he might revive and resume his attack. She gestured for Nani and Drim to come close. Drim immediately attached himself to her neck again. This time, for a short moment, she took her own measure of solace in the contact, rubbing his back, burying her face in his hair. "It's all right, little one," she whispered. She bent down to check on Amat and Nani. Amat was scared, but composed. Nani concerned her more, her expression having gone blank, and her eyes staring into space. Her tiny socks and shoes were sodden and stained with urine. When they got up to leave, Sabrina handed Drim off to his sister and carried Nani in her left arm, ignoring that her pants were warm and damp. They descended the stairs. Outside in the alleyway, Sabrina was not sure which direction to go. The children would slow her, and she could not take them into the chaos of the head ministry. She pulled on her visor and scanned the surrounding buildings and blocks in infrared. The houses were empty. The nearest movement was in an alley block to their right. From the shifting, hunched way the figure moved, Sabrina had little doubt it was a feral. Another figure appeared at the limit of her vision through the surrounding walls, followed by a second and a third. She called to Amat to follow her as she tried to move in for a better look. The 3 figures turned into a crowd of people bunched together, moving down the street, those in the center giving off much hotter signals than those on the periphery. Sabrina goaded Amat gently, but urgently, the girl responding with silent determination, leaping from side to side over the gutter of wastewater in the center of the alley, covering her brother's eyes as they stepped over a dead body. When they were just around the corner from the crowd, Sabrina hid Amat and Drim behind a reclamation bin. Extracting Nani was more difficult, but she forced the girl's hands from her neck and dropped her beside Amat. She crept to the corner and peered around the wall down the alley into the street. A crowd of terrified people materialized in the narrow gap between buildings. Men and women wearing expressions of shock moved as a dazed herd, their children clutched closely, while officers guarded the edges, their weapons turned outward. Officers and citizens alike were covered in dust and debris, their clothes stained with blood as if they had been through a running battle. Sabrina heard one officer call out her position. Someone must have seen her on the infrared. She scrambled back to the children as footsteps neared the mouth of the alleyway. The officer shouted at her to stop, but she kept moving, leaping over a body face down in the wastewater channel. When she reached the children, she turned with her weapon above her head in a surrendering motion, only to see Sean standing there, panting. 2 plasma rifles were crossed over his back, and a 3rd blaster was strapped to his thigh. His suit was torn on the chest and burned on the shoulder. His knee pads were scuffed and dirty, his visor cracked. A knife, the handle dark with blood, rested in a sheath on his hip. One of his gloves was missing, and 2 of his fingers were taped together. For a long time he looked at her in silence, coming out of his shock only when another officer called to him from the alley. Sean yelled that he had found 3 children, as if he understood that Sabrina could not return with him. "Go with Sean. He's my friend. And he'll make sure you are safe," Sabrina told Amat. She moved quickly to obey, lifting her brother and trying to pull Nani, who wanted to cling to Sabrina. Sabrina handed her to Sean, who took her as gingerly as weapons and armor would allow. It was the first time Sabrina had seen him in weeks. The smell of his body and the stubble on his jaw struck her with familiar poignancy. "Where have you been?" he asked. "I think she is going into shock," Sabrina said, settling Nani into his arms. "I'll do what I can for her." "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice almost a whisper. "The head ministry. I have to help Lindsay and Dag." "He's really your uncle?" She nodded. "I'm so sorry, Sean. There was so much I never told you." "I'm just glad you're still alive. Come with us. Come with us. I can talk to these guys." "I can't come back. I need to stop what is going to happen at the head ministry." "Then let me come with you." For a moment her heart leapt at the possibility, but when she thought of all the rebels waiting there, she knew she could not ask him to come. "No, I have to go alone. Just promise to keep these kids safe. Go north. Get as far from the city as possible. Go to the wall. There will be people there to help you. I've been there. I promise." He wore a quizzical expression, but before he could ask more questions, one of the officers called to him again, his voice closer, his footsteps just around the corner. "Coming," Sean said over his shoulder. "Lie down. They can probably see you on infrared." She leaned forward and kissed his mouth. She lingered there as long as she could, his lips parting, more from shock than passion. She put her hand on the back of his head, his salt and pepper hair stiff with grit and sweat, curled her fingers, and let her lips caress his in one final fluid motion. He tasted of salt and coppery blood. At her touch, he swayed, as if struck by a strong breeze. In this moment, on the edge of disillusion of all they knew, the destruction of facades, the ending of all things, she felt liberated, free, reborn. Nani, Sean, herself. A glimpse of a family whose full life would be lived, beginning to end, in an instant. "Thank you, Sean," she said, surprised by how her body shook as she pulled away. She brushed Nani's hair from her forehead and kissed her lightly on the temple before bending to her knees and lying on the ground, the phantom of the kiss lingering on her lips. She glanced once more at Amat and Drim, and told them again that everything would be all right. Sean, adjusting Nani's weight in his arms, was locked in some well of private pain, making Sabrina doubt the prudence of her impulse. But Nani, wrapping her arms more tightly around his neck, brought him back to himself. He dropped the muzzle of his blaster into his palm and fired a stun blast high over her before taking a slow step to turn down the alleyway with the children. "Who's down there?" an officer's voice asked from around the corner. "Just a feral," Sean replied. "She's dead now." Sabrina ran the rest of the way to the station. The readouts on her visors were blurred with tears. She killed any ferals she came across, leaving them sprawled in the street, blasting as many holes in them as she could. When she reached it, the station was a shock. Flames engulfed cruisers that had been abandoned in the street. Windows in the main building were shattered. Walls were scorched with blaster burns and cratered from projectile weapons. The gates to the vehicle bay were blown wide open. Bullet casings littered the floor. Sabrina doubted if the rebel soldiers and men conscripted to fight had understood the plan of their leaders, but she could now see it in all its cold calculation. Theopen and Rindle had planned to topple the comm towers, unleashing the ferals. The rebels probably had no idea what would happen, but their leaders surely knew. In the chaos that followed, the officers had been wide open to ambush, their advantages of numbers and technology neutralized by the surprise of the rebels and the fury of the ferals. So many dead. But what was the cost of life when the Master wills it? Sabrina kicked down the door to the facilities office, breaking into drawers to search for key cards to a cruiser. Everything had been pilfered. She immediately saw why. In her rush to enter the station, she had not even noticed the window to the cruiser bay was shattered, the work of rebels who had crawled through and ransacked the office. But 3 cruisers remained. If the keys were not in the facilities office, they would be in the maintenance office. The rebels would not have known where it was. She ran down the adjacent hallway and stopped beside a door labeled Maintenance. Haddon Blanchard was written in smaller letters just underneath. Sabrina blew it open with her blaster. The room was filled with Haddon's presence. Oiled wrenches and a tea mug sat on his desk alongside palm screens displaying maintenance checklists. She remembered their brief exchange the day she had checked out the power cycle to follow the sickness seeder to the processing facility. "How does it feel to be a hero?" he'd said. "Honestly, I hate it." She wondered where he was and if the rebels had gotten him. His boxing gloves hung from the back of the door, while Daldo stared down from a pitchball poster. Everything looked as if he was about to return. She hoped he would. She yanked open a drawer, and 3 card keys slid into view. Transport was solved. Now she needed firepower. It was no surprise when she reached the armory and found it empty. Most of the officers would have taken extra weapons into battle. What was left the rebels had stolen. She decided she would turn the rebels' devices against them. She had full run out of the abandoned station. On its lowest level, she broke into a cache of seized weapons from raids on cults. The rebels had not known about these storage areas, located deep within the station where their confiscated weapons were stored before being dismantled. Sabrina filled a bag with anything that would fit: pistols, explosives, and fat cone-shaped projectiles she took for rockets. She picked up a heavy tube with a shoulder mount that she hoped was the launcher. The roads were empty of people, but she had to navigate around cruisers that still burned wildly in the street. Instinct told her to avoid the main avenues, as well as buildings or hills where towers once stood. She could not avoid them all, however, and when she turned down Dennett Avenue, the wreckage of a comm tower stretched across the street and into a park, its antenna crushed beside a picnic bench. Wiring was strewn across the road like entrails where rebels had ripped its mechanisms apart. She skirted the wreckage, debris crunching under her tires. On the Bay Road, she opened up the thrusters to full, the wind buffeting the vehicle, the desert and ruined buildings sliding by in a blur. By the time she thought of Joseph and Magdalene, she had already passed their cafe. The best she could do was hope they had escaped the chaos. Her eyes studied the shoreline across the bay. Long columns of black smoke rose into the air around the white dome of the head ministry. She was too far to tell if the smoke came from inside or outside the building. She passed a roadblock at one of the very security posts Rindle had inquired about during her questioning. It had been overrun. What role did Lindsay play in this? What role did I play? Sabrina pressed the accelerator. She passed the turn she had taken to the waterworks so many weeks before. This time she pulled the wheel left toward the ministry. Despite the circumstances, a part of her was glad to be able to return to the heart of things, to the place that had been her home. and Dag. Lindsay had been right to give him a second chance. After all, Sabrina recognized that she might have made the same decisions, the same mistakes, walking into the scene he had walked into when he had entered her parents' home. The chaos, the confusion. Who was to judge? It was a nightmare. He had tried to rectify it in his own imperfect way. She pulled up the drive to the ministry, sweeping by the shops at the bottom of the hill where workers would walk during their lunch hours. Right now, the shops and cafes had been transformed into a makeshift infirmary where rebels tended their wounded. Sabrina got out and looked for Lindsay. Grange would have been pleased, for the medics were ministering to wounded officers as well as rebels. A few of the rebels seemed surprised when they recognized her. One of the medics in the same khaki outfit Lindsay had worn told her that Lindsay and Denalius were "Up the hill! At the gates!" She got back into her cruiser. Destroyed cruisers and desert runners smoldered along the road that was cratered from bomb blasts. The suspension of her own vehicle popped and banged beneath her. Farther up the hill, the battle was still unfolding. The blast doors of the ministry remained closed. Rebels had used every vehicle they could find in the assault, and the large white prisoner transports, the sickness seaters, had gotten farther than the smaller CRPs and desert runners. The guns and plasma cannons of the ministry had stopped 3 of the huge personnel transports just short of the gates. 2 sat on their chassis with wheels shot out. A third lay on its side. Rebels had taken cover behind them. A few security ministry officers darted between disabled cruisers, trying to turn back the assault from the ground, but they were greatly outnumbered and limited in where they could move. From above, the wall gunners sprayed the field indiscriminately. The antique turret guns on either side of the gates had come to life, churning out bullets in loud bursts, the shiny cartridges flipping outward with each discharge. The rat-tat-tat of their attack was by far the loudest noise ripping through the air. Sabrina realized that most of the rebels' attention was focused on the center of the field of battle. She could not fathom the shapes moving in the open among the barricades, walking on 8 legs connected to spider-like bodies, until one turned its eyes to her. The faces. They were Dag's fallen gods, the art installation of half-buried faces. The very same that Sabrina had seen school children playing upon in her last visit. All this time, Dag's defenses had been hiding in plain sight. Their blank faces had tipped forward to form shields, while a chrome tangle of legs and exoskeletons had unfolded from beneath them. The legs supported batteries of projectile guns, mortars, and flamethrowers, machinery for one purpose: death. Sabrina realized with one look that they were not as advanced as the Elveds. Their components' parts did not move or reassemble into different shapes. Their movements were automatic and rote, but they were effective and lethal. Though 2 had been rendered immobile by explosives and their legs destroyed, they continued to send an onslaught of missiles, flames, and bullets at anything that moved within range. They seemed to be able to discriminate between officers and rebels, unless an officer was unlucky enough to be close to rebels when a missile was fired. Sabrina watched as one face fired upon a position, incinerating rebels and officers alike. What has Dag done? As the faces advanced, the rebels retreated. One rebel fell, a bullet taking apart his right leg. As the face caught up to him, it unfolded a scorpion-like tail, the end of which held a curved blade that drove into his body. Blood splashed across the impervious face. "Lindsay, where are you?" A group of rebels close to the gate fell back as a face outflanked their position. Small amnesties formed as rebels carried wounded officers along with them, and a few officers did the same for rebels. A motley crew of officers and rebels crouched behind a smashed CRP and fired as one into an advancing face. The impassive countenance withstood the barrage, the blast leaving scorched craters around the eyes, the nose, and mouth. The officers and rebels changed their tactics and concentrated their fire on the legs, which were heavily plated but vulnerable at the joints. A lucky shot blew off a section of exoskeleton. The joint melted from a bolt of plasma, and the leg buckled. 4 more legs followed in quick succession, hobbling the machine enough for a cadre of officers to slip behind and toss sonic detonators into the working parts. The blast sent debris into the sky to fall like rain among cheering rebels and officers. Dag, you may have given them an enemy to unite around. You. From a closer position, 4 khaki-clad medics ran forward and began administering to wounded soldiers and officers alike. Sabrina recognized some of the medics, but did not see Lindsay. She drove closer. The nearest face apparently recognized the cruiser as a ministry vehicle and held its fire. She did not trust the reprieve. An officer who had been wounded in the shoulder tried to enter the vehicle, but she kept the door locked. Through a partially lowered window, she told the officer to get her one of the medics. He pounded on the glass. "Crate, open the door!" Sabrina raised one of the pistols. "The medic!" He stepped back and pulled the medic over. She was a girl Sabrina had seen with Lindsay a number of times. "Where's Lindsay?" Sabrina demanded. "She's up with Denalice," the girl said, ducking as a cluster of stray bullets strafed the cruiser. "They are in a more forward position. We cannot reach them. Their team was trying to blow the doors, but now they are trapped." The girl covered her head and crossed back to the wounded men and women, officers and rebels. So Lindsay and Denalice were trying to get to Dag, to protect him from more bloodthirsty rebels. The girl pointed to the overturned sickness seater beside the gate, where a few rebels sheltered behind it. Gate guards fired upon them from the wall above, and 2 faces moved closer. A 3rd face stood in the way. "Crate!" Sabrina jammed the accelerator and swung the vehicle around. The tires smoked as she aimed the cruiser at the body of the closest face. At the last moment before impact, it seemed to recognize her as a foe. One of its arms swiveled around and aimed a weapon. A cylinder of spinning barrels erupted, the projectiles bouncing off the windscreen in a shower of yellow sparks. She ducked while the vehicle collided with, then rolled over the face, crushing it. In the rear view, she saw its head askew, its face shattered, and legs uselessly scratching at the earth. Still, it fired a jet of flame in her wake with its flamethrower. She could feel the heat within the cruiser. The cruiser shuddered over craters and the shattered concrete that had once made up the road and sidewalks to the ministry. Rebels and officers alike cheered her arrival. She swerved around a smashed lorry and bounced over the curb, driving over ground towards the overturned transport. A large man scrambled behind it with a launcher on his shoulder. It was Denalice. He moved into the open, in dangerous range of the nearest face, and fired. A rocket soared through the air on a stream of smoke and collided with the front gate. The explosion rocked Sabrina's cruiser. When the smoke cleared, the gates were bowed inward, but still intact. Wall guards reinforcing the antique guns fired blasters. Sensing a serious threat in Denalice, they were firing lethal blasts of red plasma. The face nearest turned and began firing on Denalice's position. The tower gunner triangulated at him. Denalice jumped near Lindsay. She pulled him back, and they pressed themselves closely to the chassis as projectiles pinged and banged off the rolled sickness seater. Plasma scorched the flanks of the vehicle and shattered the windows. The face rotated a flamethrower onto one of its forelegs, the pilot flame flickering at the blackened mouth. Fury erupted in Sabrina, and she steered the cruiser into the robot. The silver face turned at the last moment, aiming the spinning barrels of a machine gun at the windscreen. Weakened from the previous fire, it did not hold. Glass shattered down on her and across the instrumentation. The cruiser bucked as it collided with the machine head-on, rolled onto it, and stopped. Sabrina pressed the accelerator, but the front tires spun uselessly. The cruiser was tipping backwards, rising and falling violently as the machine beneath struggled to stand erect again. The weight of the cruiser on top proved too much, and the machine crashed down again, crushed. Sabrina tried the accelerator again, but the wheels were still too far off the ground. The machine was pinned. The cruiser was stuck. Stalemate. She had struck her head on the steering wheel and fought against dizziness as she tried to extricate herself from the wreck. She lost her balance each time the machine underneath tried to rise again, tipping the stalled cruiser as broken glass cascaded off surfaces to collect on the floor. When the cruiser came down again, she saw the second face staring at her, moving towards her across the cratered landscape. Another round of bangs and pops sounded as the machine opened fire on her. She scrambled to the back seat. The shoulder launcher she had brought rolled back and forth on the seat. She pulled it free of other weapons. One of the rockets was on the floor of the cruiser, but it rolled away out of her reach. She stretched her hand under the seat, but the rocket was stuck. The vehicle rocked again and her wrist was twisted painfully. More bangs as the second face strafed from the side. Flames seared the sides of the vehicle as the face beneath tried to light the cruiser on fire. A second loose rocket hit her hand. She grabbed it, jammed it into the launcher, and slapped the emergency release for the roof escape. The panel on top of the vehicle ejected a hiss of pressurized gas. A perfect square of blue sky appeared. She grabbed the side of the cruiser and lifted herself into the gap just as the vehicle was rising again. Her horizon tipped higher and higher. She readied the launcher, waiting. The face beneath had nearly extricated itself, for the cruiser was nearly vertical. Just when she thought the face would roll the cruiser off this time, it lost its footing again, and the vehicle came crashing down, right before the second machine. She fired. The blast knocked her against the inside frame of the cruiser, the heat searing her face. Engulfed in flames, the machine rocked and then ran in random directions, guidance systems melting and metal screaming as it expanded. The face shuddered to a stop, a shriveled spider engulfed in flames. Sabrina dropped to the ground, holding her blistered face. Lindsay called her name, but she was too disoriented to locate her. Strong arms seized Sabrina, and Denali pulled her behind the transport. Lindsay, her face darkened by ash and soot, embraced her. Sabrina stared, unbelieving, until a fresh volley of fire from the tower gunner hammered the side of the vehicle. Their embrace of affection turned into one of fear as they cowered, waiting for the volley to end. "So much for my rescue," she said, nodding towards the ruined cruiser. "You came," Lindsay said. "You're a fool, but you came." "Lindsay, the camp, it was destroyed. Grange? Dead. Sprocket is alive." Sabrina wanted to tell her how she had remembered everything, how she knew who she really was, that she too wanted to reach Dag. Strangely, she was filled with joy and was so overcome she could not find words. They were once again together, on the same side. But Lindsay screamed. "Denali!" He was dead, the last volley having struck him in the neck and head. They had not even seen his last moments. Lindsay lunged for the body, which was dangerously exposed. The tower gunner fired again. Sabrina tried pulling her back, but Lindsay shook her off. She dragged the body partly into cover, then cut the strap to remove the satchel from around his arm. The satchel held a clutch of rockets that were bigger and heavier than the one Sabrina had fired. Lindsay turned again to the body. "Crite!" Lindsay said. "Crite!" "Lindsay! Launcher's destroyed," she said. Then Sabrina saw the launcher on its side, its casing shattered. Lindsay's eyes were fixed straight ahead, unfocused, tears wetting her cheeks, even while her lips were set in a determined frown. "Sabrina, this has to end. It has to. I know. Promise me. Promise me you will always make sure there is justice with the peace that follows. What are you talking about? Promise me you will allow for people to believe. You've seen it now. People need to believe like they need to breathe." Lindsay's hands were busy reaching into the bag. She unscrewed the tips of the rockets and connected them to a red wire that had been coiled in the bottom of the bag. The wire ran to a device molded to fit into a palm with a red button on it. "Lindsay, talk to me. What are you doing?" Lindsay said nothing and continued to connect the cones by the cable. "Lindsay!" Sabrina grabbed her by the shoulder and threw her against the underside of the transport. It was strange to move her so suddenly without the bells sounding in her hair. "What are you doing? Let's get out of here!" "I love you, Sabrina," she said. "I love you so much. You are my best friend, my sister. You always have been, always will be, even in the next life. I know you don't believe in it, but I do. Enough for both of us. This has to stop. You're going to see it. You're going to see it to its end. And I'll see you on the other side. This is crazy. You can't. All this belief stuff is crazy. No, it's not. Lindsay smiled with a serenity Sabrina recognized from Bran as they stood in Will's grave. Because even though I know I love you so much, I love God more. He sent you to me in the first place. She tried to jerk away from Sabrina's grasp, but Sabrina was too strong. Another volley of fire from the tower punched through the vehicle and cratered the ground between them. Sabrina fell backwards. Lindsay leapt up and charged into the open. "Get to Dag first!" she screamed. The tower gun roared to life again. Sabrina threw herself into range, firing upwards as she called Lindsay's name. The gunner lowered the barrels of his gun. "Lindsay, wait!" But Lindsay was already in the open, running for the gate, the satchel of rockets swinging under her arm, her braids bouncing in a wild frenzy. Sabrina watched as the gunner in the right turret turned his gun in Lindsay's direction, the barrels flashing with rapid salvos, mushrooming the earth around her in strafing rows. A row passed from one side of Lindsay's body to the next, and a blossom of red bloomed on her back. She staggered before Sabrina lifted her own weapon and let loose a furious series of blasts to cover her. She continued her salvo too long for safety, drawing on the gunner's fire and ducking only when the bullets banged on the transport just inches from her head. Sabrina crawled to the corner of the vehicle, propping herself on Denalis's body, straining to see Lindsay as she neared the shadow of the gate. Sabrina aimed another volley at the gunner. None of her shots were accurate at that angle, but they drew the attention of the gunner long enough for Lindsay to press herself against the doors, out of reach of the turret guns. A dozen more shots pounded the fender before Sabrina ducked again. The fire intensified. The gunner did his best to rip the transport to pieces and hit Sabrina. Shrapnel showered down onto her as she belly-crawled to the far side of the vehicle, pressing her face to the ground as bullets struck the dirt around her. When she did not emerge, the fire turned away to the next closest cluster of rebels. Sabrina continued to crawl. She had an unobstructed view of Lindsay around the cab. Lindsay had stopped at the center of the gate, crouched down, a smear of red on the doors behind her where her back had touched the rusted metal. Her skin was ashen, and her hands trembling. The cable was clenched between her teeth. She unscrewed another nose cone and discarded it, like a child tossing aside a bottle cap. When a row of bullets strafed the ground beside her, she pulled her leg back and almost tumbled over before she balanced herself against the doors, the gunshot in her shoulder causing her to wince and cry out. She placed the rockets on the earth in a row like tubers. Her motions were cut short when a blast of red plasma grazed her head, throwing her back against the gate doors. Sabrina screamed, threw herself into the open, firing at the gunner who had descended from the gun seat to lean over the wall and take aim at Lindsay with a blaster. Sabrina's shot struck him in the chest, flinging him back over the wall, a cloud of smoke from smoldering clothes left in his wake. Lindsay remained pressed against the gate doors, her face contorted in pain, the hair on the side of her head singed off. She dropped to the ground to extend her hand and clutch the detonator that had fallen just out of her reach. "Lindsay, don't!" Lindsay did not look her way as more gunners appeared on the wall. Her hand found the smoothly molded piece of plastic and pulled it to her chest, holding it over her heart, with her eyes lifted up to the sky. Her lips moving in silent prayer, her ears deaf to Sabrina's cries. She depressed her thumb and detonated both their lives.